Hi Samuel, I'm Vasilije Radovanović from Serbia, and I'm a student at Yale Young Global Scholars, Yale's summer program for high school students. I'm currently in Yale Law School interviewing Professor Semjuelom Mojnom, Chancellor Kent Professor of History and Law at Yale University. Could you tell us something about yourself?
I work in this building teaching law, and I sometimes teach history to graduate students and undergraduates. I'm from the center of the United States, from Missouri, and I've lived in Berkeley, where I did my doctorate in history, and on the East Coast, where I've mostly taught at a few different universities. And I've mainly written about the history of human rights in the past decade or so, and I've tried to retire from that and move on to other things.
Mm-hmm. What was about your lecture here at Young Global Scholars?
It was really just a kind of summary of my main research findings about where the idea and practices associated with human rights came from.
Mm-hmm. And did you find the discussions and questions from the students interesting?
Oh, terrific. I mean, I give the same lecture every year in the Yale Global Scholars program, and this year was the first time back in person in a while. So it was excellent to have a very animated conversation with 150 people. Very interesting.
So can I ask you something about topics you mentioned in lecture? So what are the roots of universalism in human rights and politics at all?
Well, so, my views are very contentious. They're not, I'm not trying to state the obvious, but on this topic I said, most people think of universalism as very hard to achieve, and, humans are locked up in family, tribe, and nation until they realize that all humans are in the same ethical situation. And I argued that actually it seems as if universalism appears very early in history, and that the record of our morality over the past several millennia is really a kind of confrontation of different universalistic schemes with one another. And if you think about it that way, you have Christianity, Islam, capitalism, communism. Human rights are a kind of late-come universalism that became credible to us in pretty recent times, after millennia in which other formal universalisms prevailed.
Mm-hmm. And what influenced creating modern human rights?
Well, I argued that there are really two stages to the answer to that question. Human rights do become politically explosive in revolutionary politics, like in the American and French and Haitian revolutions. And there, the politics is oriented around self-help and state construction, the foundation of sovereignty, and the tools include violence if necessary. And that history lasts until roughly the middle of the 20th century. When people appealed to rights, sometimes they wanted to limit their states from within, but often they were engaged in claims about, founding a new state. And then I argued that human rights in a second version emerged more recently, about 50 years ago. And it involved really more constraining the state from without through international law, identifying with kind of non-fellows, people far away, and also in an interesting way, the renunciation of the tool of violence. So most people who say they're for human rights are not revolutionaries. They engage in other activities like informational politics, naming and shaming, or lawsuits.
While earlier, people who were fighting for the rights of the man were actually revolutionaries and terrorists in the French Revolution.
In the eyes of their opponents, these first human rights activists were terrorists because they were contesting established political authority. And it's not that every revolutionary appealed to human rights in world history. In your part of the world, I mean, was the Black Hand a human rights organization? I would not go that far, although we would have to look into what its leaders said their cause was. It's very interesting that in the 19th century, leading up to World War I, nationalism was a kind of human rights movement, because if you believed in human rights, you said it has to be established for a nation currently under imperial rule. And of course, that was the case of the Serbians. But that doesn't mean that every nationalist appealed to human rights. And I think over time, the connection between these two became more and more frayed.
So today, nationalism and human rights are quite different terms.
I think so. Maybe we think that in any successful uprising, even nonviolent nationalist sentiment comes into play. So consider the Arab Spring. We could say it was about human rights, but it seemed to be about also at times, a national proposal for a national alternative. And, there are different kinds of nationalism. I think some more liberal, more based on rights than others, but all exclusionary in some way or another.
Thank you. And you mentioned a Black Hand, so that's interesting. What is your opinion about them and about nationalism and human rights policies in Serbia and in the Balkans region in 19th and 20th century?
Well, I'm not terribly well educated on the topic, but I would venture to say that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was oppressive to those nations that it ruled imperially. Not all in the same way, and of course the Hungarians got special status. And yet we can look back and say that your country's national movement caused a world war. Now, they could only do so because of an alliance structure of great powers. And so it's not as if we want to pin the blame on one man who assassinated one prince, because there was a situation that made a general war possible. But unlike other nationalist movements, the Serbian one was implicated in the coming of the era of the world wars. Later on, I myself worked in the White House during the bombing of Serbia in 1999. And in my opinion, I don't think that recent forms of Serbian nationalism, as I understand them, have been very progressive. I think they, presupposed a communist experience, which was terrible, but they responded to the end of communism in ways that I think set the world back, set Serbia back, and set humanity back in certain ways.
It's also there are similarities between Serbia and China and Russia. So Mao Zedong was, for his first 10 years of rule, a leftist, but then he started to be a nationalist.
So I mean, I would have said that that most 20th century socialisms have been nationalist to a varying impressive extent. And I think one thing that socialists learned over time is that the combination of nationalism and socialism would produce potent effects. Back in the origins of nationalism, like at the time of this famous Italian nationalist Giuseppe Mazzini in the early 19th century, nationalism was relatively liberal. But in the later 19th century, with the rise of racial theory, what we call ethno-nationalism emerged. And this could take left-wing forms, but I don't think it's probably true to say that, you know, leftism and nationalism are mutually exclusive. You know, same with liberalism and nationalism. Liberals invented nationalism, like Mazzini was a liberal. So nationalism, it serves a lot of different forces.
Thanks. And what's the difference between the socialism, like Bernie Sanders in the US and Western Europe, maybe like Norway, like these Nordic countries, and in Eastern Europe, socialism?
Right. Well, you know, Sanders has, you know, idealized Denmark, and so he's really thinking of social democracy. And he calls himself a socialist, but that's permissible because socialism doesn't really mean anything by itself. It could mean a lot of different things. In Eastern Europe, of course, you got state socialism, which was a one-party state. In that case, in an empire of one-party states, with the Soviets at the top. You know, famously in the Cold War, there was a split between the Soviet masters of the Eastern Bloc Empire and the Yugoslav Tito.
Oh, yes.
But nonetheless, these were all state socialisms, one-party states, basically with dictatorial power, secret police, and that's not at all what Bernie Sanders has in mind.
Yes, and you mentioned Tito, so it's can you explain to us how like these policies in Eastern Europe were functioning? Because like Tito, he would imprison everyone who was against Stalin, and when he broke up with Stalin, he would imprison all those who were for Stalin. So basically, they would be together in same cell.
Right. You know, I'm not an expert again, but you're of course right that politicians are opportunistic, and state socialism was, you know, a rationalization for elite rule. A certain new class. It wasn't aristocrats and kings anymore. It was nationalist leaders, in this case of the left-wing variety, whose main goal was their own power and its perpetuation. Nonetheless, there were always interesting experiments. You know, down into the 1980s, there was a big discussion in the West of so-called self-management in Yugoslavia, where allegedly workers ran their own factories, and this was of considerable interest among non-communist socialists in the West when socialism was fashionable 50 or 60 years ago.
Although Noam Chomsky, he wrote something about the the self-rule among
Yes.
manufacturers.
Many people wrote
Yes.
about it. It was like a central topic in an era when, you know, of course there were many just blind anti-communists in the West, but others who discriminated and could see that Stalin and Tito were on opposite sides of some questions, and that there were different ways of organizing the economy in the Eastern Bloc.
Yes, and it's interesting how that influenced also universities.
Yes.
So universities had some chance to think of to have freedom in their opinion, but that was that freedom was later destroyed when they saw
Yes.
that's bad for their interests. So
Right.
we don't know that in Serbia. So can you tell us about that?
Well, you know, it's only fair that in Western countries we should say that there was a lot of interest in establishing the autonomy of universities. Even so, there were repressive campaigns, especially when a lot of professors who had socialist sympathies were just fired in the 1950s. So it's not as if the West was a paradise of academic freedom. And indeed, many of the main ideas about academic freedom and scholarly independence in the West were developed out of reflection on, you know, what happened through blacklisting, as it was called here, to socialist professors. of course, as of the late 1940s, when there's a takeover of Eastern Europe by communist forces, the universities are Sovietized, and certain topics are mandatory, and certain views are treated as, taboo. And at least in my understanding, and again, I'm not an expert, academic freedom was purged, and communist universities became doctrinaire in many topics. Nonetheless, we know that, especially in the natural sciences, there could be, gifted scholars and major achievements made in communist countries during the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so now to get back to the main topic we were talking about.
Right.
So how does human rights movement has connections with global inequality and neoliberalism?
Well, there's a big debate about how to explain the relation between the ascendancy of human rights as a kind of moral lingua franca after the 1970s and the changes in the global economy. Because many states, and this included communist ones at the time, moved in the direction of austerity policies after the 1970s, and sometimes these are called neoliberal. I wrote a book about 5 years ago called Not Enough, which is an investigation of this question. And unlike some of my Marxist colleagues who think of human rights as a bourgeois ideology that serves capitalism, I tried to take a different view, that the trouble is that human rights had nothing to say about inequality. And socialism did, and became, unsustainable in a neoliberal world. But human rights could survive because they only talked about poverty. Human rights even today are mostly about how individuals don't have adequate housing or health or sanitation or water or access to them. They don't give us a language with which to challenge class inequality. Of course, Marxism was centrally about kind of capitalist exploitation and the class struggle. Human rights aren't about those topics. And in our world, we've seen a recrudescence of class inequality. Many places around the world, in the developed world and the developing world, are seeing unprecedented class hierarchy. And so human rights didn't challenge that, not directly at least. And so my theory was that human rights could be a kind of surviving ideology in the later Cold War and after the Cold War, in part because they didn't challenge neoliberalism, even if they weren't themselves neoliberal principles.
So that is human rights movement good or bad?
No answer. I think it's good at doing some things and raising some concerns, and bad at other things. So my main claims have been that it's good at raising awareness on a global stage, especially about certain kinds of states doing certain kinds of things. It's bad actually at improving those issues. I mean, we know a lot more about torture, but it's not clear that knowing gives us tools for improving the world. And then there's a lot that human rights leaves out. So I mentioned that it's not a good framework for contesting inequality as opposed to poverty. I've also written a book recently that's about how human rights movements are not peace movements. If they have something to say about war, human rights movements call for it to be conducted humanely. And this could be problematic because we should have movements that condemn war and try to keep it from happening or stopping it once it starts.
You mentioned peace movements, so are these other movements ignored, or like what should be improved in human rights movements, and how that should be coordinated with other movements?
That's a great question. So, I mean, human rights movements, just on the core norms that they, care about, have a lot of work to do, because, as I said, they seem to be good at stigma, allocating stigma in the world, raising consciousness, if you want to put it that way, but they don't seem to get results. So I think the central challenge for human rights movements is to try to do better in actually changing the world rather than just our minds. And then there's this question you ask about other movements. Well, I think it's not up to human rights movements to become other kinds of movements. It's our responsibility to found those movements or rediscover them. Peace movements, socialist movements of a certain kind. And then there's this intricate question you ask: what should the relation between different kinds of movements be? And I would hope there would be a kind of synergy, like they could work together on certain issues. They would have some division of labor, but they might also combine in certain instances because they have shared challenges.
People in Serbia, when they hear about human rights, and me when I was younger, that was something bad.
Right.
And because we don't know too much about religion also, and we kind of see that as two opposite things. So
right.
Does a religion has something to do with human rights?
Well, there's a lot to say there. It's religion, I think, can be seen as one of the predecessor universalisms. Christianity, which once was very important in Serbia, was about the coming of the kingdom of God for all human beings. So it's just as universalistic as human rights. Its content is different. Some people argue that human rights should be seen as like crypto-Christian, or a kind of modeling itself on Christianity, a kind of new church. I don't think that's too simplistic, but there are some interesting parallels. I actually wrote a small book called Christian Human Rights, which is an attempt to kind of think about these parallels. Of course, religion figures in human rights in the sense that there are supposed to be protections of belief, and especially manifestation of belief within some limits. So that could be religious belief. And there are very interesting arguments about human rights and religion. Famously, the European Court of Human Rights was very tolerant of Christianity and intended to allow a lot of state interference with Muslim practices. And that, was very, controversial in an era in which, immigration from former imperial spaces of Muslims was kind of increasing, and the face of European societies was changing, Western European. The Syrian refugee crisis kind of added to this sense. And so that's a really interesting topic as well, but that's more about how human rights governs religion today.
But religion has, actually human rights has its roots in religion.
I think everything has its roots in religion in some way, in the sense that nothing comes from nothing, and even the opposition to religion had to develop out of and within and eventually against a religious worldview and a religious world, where religion was much more hegemonic than it is now. So in some sense, religion led to its own marginalization. We have to explain how that happened.
Okay, because you were talking at the our lecture about anti-slavery movement and how this, is anti-slavery movement some beginning of human rights movement?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's not like there's nothing to say in favor of that view, but most of those who opposed slavery were Christians and had Christian reasons for opposing slavery. Now, there are also Christian reasons for supporting slavery for most of history. So it was a new thing in the later 18th and 19th century for Christians to oppose Christianity, to oppose slavery, but most of those who opposed slavery, especially in more radical ways, had Christian reasons for doing so. Like in our country, a famous abolitionist like John Brown was very deeply inspired by his millennialist beliefs. I think later in the 20th century, once human rights became something visible, of course, the prohibition of slavery was something that people treated as a human right. But it was only, in a sense, forged before human rights had their contemporary meaning.
You mentioned Muslims, and
yes,
I think actually Muslims had some good human rights practices earlier. Like good example is Salah ad-Din. Can you tell about that something?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you because it's not like they had the phrase human rights. So did they do things that overlapped with human rights as we understand them today? For sure. But that's like saying, as I mentioned in the lecture, that every ethical system has prohibited murder with some exceptions. But that doesn't mean that every ethical system is for human rights. A very commonly, cited precursor to human rights would be, in the Mughal Empire, where there was a kind of claim that religion should coexist rather than go to war with each other. Once again, does that mean that there were human rights at that time? Well, you can say that, but it misses that human rights are really a new framework for thinking and acting, and we have to figure out what's specific about it.
Okay, and you were also talking about people when they were in tribes living. How that much changed from earlier periods to now? Does people still look only for their own group of people and take care of them, or they are open to having a moral consciousness about other groups of people?
Well, so one of my main points in the lecture is that whatever we say about tribal consciousness, the real issue is that very early on, it became possible to think of one's ethical views as applying to everyone, everywhere, and always. And then the fight was, well, which ethical views, which purported to be universalistic, should win? Now, if we take up tribal peoples, we're talking about literally millions of different groups across the planet, and it's very hard to generalize about them. But we do have good evidence that many tribes, so-called, themselves had universalistic conceptions. They had cosmic beliefs about the place of humanity in the scheme of the cosmos, and often they thought of themselves as the real humans. A good example would be a South American tribe that an author I like named Pierre Clastre studies. This tribe was called the Ake, which means people. It doesn't mean, nation. It means that tribe thought of itself as human beings. So even tribes could have a certain universalistic consciousness. Now, of course, they fought with other tribes that may themselves have seen their tribe as kind of the true humans. So maybe there's nothing really tribal ever about humanity. There are just different groups of people who always think that their views and practices are ones that should be hegemonic everywhere.
Mm. So does that have to do, does that have, is in relation with nationalism?
Well, so it depends. I mean, if you're a Serbian nationalist, you could say the reason Serbia should have a state, should control its territory for the sake of the Serbian people, is because every people should have a state and should have some government that protects it. But that's a universalistic principle. Mm-hmm. Now, someone like Adolf Hitler didn't have that universalism. He wanted the Germans to have an empire, but he didn't want others to do so. Now, actually, he admitted a certain amount of pluralism. He didn't believe in global domination. And he, I think, foresaw a 1,000-year Reich in which there would be other empires, like the Anglophone Empire. As far as I can see, nationalism can be highly universalistic, and it can also be an ideology in which universalistic principles are advanced.
So universalism is actually some, it's part of human beings, like they're...
It seems like it's very old. I don't want to say definitively that there was always universalism. Maybe there were tribes in the past that really did think of themselves as, a separate category of people. Everyone else was effectively an alien. But for a long time, I think, millennia, we've had ideologies that said they were applicable to everyone, everywhere, always, and then they're universalistic, just like human rights is today.
And you mentioned Adolf Hitler. In one interview you said that Adolf Hitler had a humanitarian intervention when he,
of course,
when he attacked other countries.
Just like Vladimir Putin today. In 1945, with the UN Charter, humanitarian intervention was not allowed because it was understood that allowing humanitarian intervention, like the one that NATO conducted illegally over Serbia in 1999, could be a pretext, and it was for Hitler. It is for Putin today, I believe. But he definitely claimed that it was crucial for Germans abroad to be protected, not just because they were Germans, but because they were people who were being mistreated by their own governments.
When humanitarian interventions became allowed, because you mentioned by UN Charter...
They never became allowed. Mm-hmm. So this is, some people think that they're legal, but many international lawyers think that they're not legal unless they're authorized with the UN Security Council. But as an example, the 1999 NATO bombing of Serbia was not authorized by the Security Council. Russia vetoed it. Other humanitarian interventions have been authorized up to a point by the UN Security Council. An example would be the Libyan intervention in 2011, I believe. And yet, many people contend that those who intervened, like France and the United States, overstepped the UN's authorization when they decided to change regimes and essentially depose the leader of that country. So, humanitarian intervention could be a good thing. I don't think so, because it usually makes the world worse, but it's not clear that it's legal, that it ever became legal.
And you mentioned NATO bombing, so you at that time worked at the White House. So can you tell us about your role you had then?
I was a lowly intern in this. I just was a law student at the time, and I signed up to work there. It was a very small staff. on working on this issue, I mainly just did what my superior said. We weren't doing anything military in the sense that that was done by the Department of Defense. We were more in kind of looking at kind of policy and coordination of the American government. I did have a role in what is called public diplomacy, so kind of shaping the narrative of the war for the U.S. government's audiences.